He's the Savior. There's so much power in His blood. He's the answer. He's the healer. He's the high priest. The work is done. He's the shepherd. He's the Savior. There's so much power in His blood. The only thing that
Evening, everyone. Well, there you go. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. The year was 1933, and there was a lot going on in the world. In Europe, it was the rise of a man named Adolf Hitler, who you may have heard of before. In the United States, we were smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression, and there was also the New Deal began. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected as president. They also moved the inauguration date from a day in March to January 20th in 1933, which is pretty interesting. But we're not interested in America or Germany tonight. We're interested about what was going on in Africa in 1933 when someone we know and love, Dr. Sam Vinton, was burst onto the scene and ready to start changing the world. And we're so glad that he followed God's call and did what God asked of him, and we get to be beneficiaries of that tonight and hear from him. So, Dr. Sam, come on up. I'll give you a word of prayer, and then we'll allow you to chat. Father, thank you so much for Dr. Sam. The years of his ministry and the extent of his wisdom is rich. His testimony is powerful, and the lives that he's touched are because of your son, and we recognize that this evening. As we listen and hear the highs and lows of his story, may we just listen with attentive ears and open hearts to see how your spirit will move. Thank you for his sensitivity to your calling, and thank you for all the ways that he's blessed us here at Parkside and the thousands of people outside that we'll never even know until heaven. Thank you for the goodness of his heart and his humility, and as he shares, may we just be blessed and encouraged, and may he be so also. Thank you for your spirit and for your son, and we give all of this back to him this evening. In your son's name, we pray. Amen. Take it away, Dr. Sam.
Amen. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Pastor Gary. I'm sorry he's not here. He's the one with a few who came to him to say, and you know, he has a class, Sunday, I call them Sunday school, but they're not Sunday school, what do you call it, Bible classes, where he has people sharing their story. And that's something that Pastor Gary has had in his mind, and actually I think it's Bill English who really got them going on that, because when Bill English went to Hawaii to serve there for a couple of years, that's one of the things that they made every one of the workers tell their story. And I think that one of the things that we try to do that at Grace Christian University too is instead of just giving people, okay, here's an outline for yourself to tell you our salvation, put it into your own life, what happened to you. And that's where that story thing always is also a very good thing to do, because you meet people and they say, where are you from? Well, they tell you, okay, I'll tell you my story. Well, you move right into your own story, where you were born and so forth, and you move into salvation. It makes it an easy way to do it instead of trying to preach to them as they would, I think. So I'm thankful to Pastor Gary for asking me to do this. It's the first time I've ever done this as far as putting it together and trying to tell about my story. And I thank Pastor Jerry. You see the pictures up here. If it wasn't Pastor Jerry, we wouldn't have any pictures that he has put together to try and at least give us a sense where some of the things that we did. And we are going to have a question time before. So if you see a picture and you wonder what it is, you can ask it then. Or if I'm in a place where you can ask it right then and say, what's that? I can try and tell you. But basically, we're going to try and make sure we do that. Because I know, and my focus is going to be more in the area of my ministries in Africa rather than here in the States. I mean, I'll just summarize that at the end. And so I want to say, first of all, that I'm going to talk a little bit more about my parents than probably that would be something that people would expect me to do, because that's not me. But I want to say to you that if it wasn't for my parents, not only I wouldn't have been born and been here, but also, as I will say as I move along, the influence of my parents on my life is something I cannot really count and say what they did. Most of it was seeing. To see the love of my parents for people, as I think of that, compassion, the fact that my father came, he was born in Pennsylvania, a town named Indiana, north of Pittsburgh. He was the first of 10 children, and my grandfather was a superintendent of the coal mines in that area of Pennsylvania, and so that's where he was born in 19 07. Then he went to Pittsburgh Bible Institute, which school does not exist anymore, but it was there in Pittsburgh. And that's where he met my mother, except at that time, he was only just barely 20 years old. And so he never explained really what they did as far as making an arrangement about getting married. And then a missionary from Africa came and started talking about the needs of in Congo. He was a missionary from in there. And so my dad said, well, I just graduated. I'm 20 years old. I'll go with you. So he took off and went to Africa. At that time, they take a boat from New York and would travel all the way across to Spain, get another boat and takes them through the Mediterranean and goes over through the Suez Canal, down on the east side of Africa, all the way to Dar es Salaam, which is a town where any of us who travel over there and the ministries that we have in Tanzania, that's the capital city of the country, and that's where they got a train, and then that train took them back over to the Lake Tanganyika, crossed over on the other side, picked up a train there, and that took them to Kindu, which I'll be mentioning. That is sort of the closest place to where we grew up, that there was a city. There's a hospital there. It is a headquarters of many merchants, Greeks, Indian people who had stores there. And so that's the town where then from there on to move where he was really feeling that he needs to go and serve the Lord, or where the mission had a project for him, was to walk about 5 to 10 days into the forest. One of the things that was interesting for my dad to tell me, one time I was talking to him, he said, you know, when I walked there before, at the entrance of every village, there was a little building that they put up there for an idol, they worship the god of that particular town. Every village, I saw that. He said, you go there today, there's a church in every village. And that was the thing that began. And then my dad, like I said, back in those days, they really didn't teach us much about cultural anthropology and how you treat people and how you try and figure out where they're coming from. But for some reason, he had quite a good grasp of that. And when he gets to the village, he would sleep. They just would give him a room. I suppose he had a cot or something that they used back in those days when they traveled like that. And he would sit around the fire in the evening and talk to people and ask them what they believed. And they said, well, we believe in a God who's called Kalaga. And he said, what does he do? He said, he's the one who created the world. He's the one who's in charge. And those little places that you see in front of our villages are places we can't go straight to him. We have to go through these gods where they would take it to another place up in heaven for our ancestors, and they're the ones who go to God and speak for us. And I opened up for my dad to say, well, the story I've got to bring to you, that God up there comes directly to us through Jesus. And so those are the ways that my dad began doing his evangelism. And so for the first 2 years, he was assigned to go through that area in the villages, preach, see people come to the Lord and get a church going. And he did that for 2 years. After 2 years, he came to the conclusion, how can I tell these people about they're going to heaven, but I have nothing to help them live, take care of their diseases, sicknesses. There was no medical service. And he found out from the Belgian government that they have a special 1-year intensive course on tropical medicine for nurses. So he could go to Belgium and get a certification so he could come and do medical work. At that same time, after my dad left, about a year later, my mother, who went to the board, and they accepted her as a missionary to go to Congo. They probably had some kind of arrangement. If things go well, we'll get together. I don't know exactly how they did that back in those days. But in any case, she then arrived in Congo a year after my dad, by a year and a half after my dad, and was on a different station about 80 miles away, where she learned the language and then began teaching children in the schools there. My dad came to the conclusion that I cannot just go on preaching to these people. Even though I believe in evangelism, I believe in that, but I believe people also have a right to be treated as human beings and to be helped medically. And he had a very strong interest in medicine. I think he could have become a doctor if he had stayed in America. He was an Eagle Scout. He went through a lot of first aid and all those kind of things that he did. And so anyway, he took off and went to Belgium. He had to go to France to learn French, and from there he went to Belgium and studied for the year. It is a concentrated course of 1 year of tropical medicine that he to prepare him as a nurse. And back in those days, nurses only had a year or two of medical training. And so he went back and spent a 6 months internship. He and my mother got together and said, we're going to get married. And the Belgian government said, you have to go through all this, write papers, go call your government, give us papers. It was a depression. Congo's embassy, American embassy, was closed. So the closest place would be South Africa, and how you got to South Africa, and we didn't have internet and that kind of stuff nowadays. So they said, forget it. They got on the ship and crossed over into Tanzania, which is not, it was Tanganyika then. The British were ruling that. Found the justice of the peace, came to him and said, would you marry us? He said, who are your witnesses? He said, we don't know anybody here. He said, go around there, find 2 people, give them each $1, and they'll come and stand here with you. And so they got married and got back on the ship and came across to the Congo, took the train to Kindu, and that's when they moved to where I grew up in Kama, where my dad had been doing some work there, and he had left a house made out of muds and sticks as a temporary house, and he got, I think, a brick machine from the government, and was making bricks and burning them to build a house which is where I grew up, and that's a house that is still there even today. I was there 2 years ago, and that's a house now that they use actually for a guest house for people who are government officials. If you're a bishop or something like that, maybe you might be able to stay in there, I don't know. Anyway, for big people, whether it be religious or government, and they fixed that, they've done a good job to keep it. It's not exactly as it was when I was a kid, because Bill and Sue lived there, and Bill added a section there for his office and his books and everything. So, but it's still there, and it's in good shape. It was built of bricks, and so my dad got back. That's where they moved out. After a few months, they found out that they were expecting, and so here came the problem. What do you do? There's no hospital. There's nothing here. Evidently, my dad had a friend who was with a Methodist mission, which would have been to get back to Kindu, take a train to another city, and then take a Model T car someone had there to get to the hospital. And so when my mother was 8 months pregnant, they decided to go, and she had to be carried on these teapoys, these hammocks. 2 people up front, 2 people in the back. You've seen those maybe in some movies, so forth. My mother was carried in that for almost 10 days across. They would go to a village, sleep there. They had folding beds, mosquito nets. Oh, can you imagine that? And then I never had a chance to really ask her, how in the world did you stand there? Because they get tired if they have a pole between them, and every so often the guy, gang, then they move it over on the other side. So my mother was going up and down that way. And people said to me one time, how is it are you Italian? Why do you always use your hands? I said, for those 10 days, I was bouncing around. And so that's the reason. And anyway, so they made that trip, got to the Methodist mission. Actually, when they got at the end of the train, this friend of my dad came. It's 1933, so Model T or A, I don't know what car it was. A car. They were attacked by a buffalo. They came and ran into the front and bent the fender, so that my dad had to get out there and pull the fender back so that they could travel again until they got to the hospital. And that's where they were until I was born, and then I don't know how many weeks they waited before they went back the same back road again. But going back, my dad made arrangements with the chiefs to have double porters. So because it was too tiring and they get tired, so he had them closer, so he made it back in 5 days. He told me, I said, I cut 5 days off of that trip by having enough porters waiting along the way so we can changing them off for us to get there. And so that's my beginning there at Kama. And I mentioned again, I say, my dad, I'll say a little bit more, but I felt as I grew up that there was something about my parents, the idea of compassion for people. And one of the things that comes back to my mind when I think of that issue, Steve Vinton, who is a nephew of mine, who is in Tanzania and different countries now. I think he has 5 countries now. He has building schools, high schools for people over there. He was in Congo working as a short-term missionary between college. Actually, I think it was between, he'd go 2 years to college, go back there for a year, comes back, and he had excellent French training in high school for some reason that he could teach in French. But my dad was sitting down, he told me the story. He said, your dad was reading this book written by a very famous missionary to India. And he said, as he came to a place, this man said, we should feel for people. And he said, I watched your dad, and he reached down to get a pen, and he said, that's not enough. And he wrote on it, and do something about it. And that was my dad's philosophy of life. You feel for people, like he felt that they needed medical treatment. He went to Europe and studied. And all through his life, I saw that. Now, as a kid, I suppose, it comes back to me, inside of me, that the way my mother and my dad treated people and helped the sick. I have one of the stories that I have about my mother. I hope I don't disturb any of you with it. But some Belgium, and just remember, during that time, as I'm growing up, I'm into 5, 6, 7 years old, it's the World War. So Belgians who ran the country could not go back to Germany. To Belgium, because Germans had taken over the country. So my dad had a lot of Belgian friends. There are mining companies there, the government officials. And so I began hearing French. I grew up with 4 languages, 2 that I really knew well, and then finally I didn't get to know French very well in my studies, and the other tribal dialect that I know, but that I didn't use it enough. It'd take me about a month in a village before I could get it back into my mind anymore. Anyway, so we had those people coming there, and the man came and said to us, you boys need a dog. And, okay, and gave us a big dog. Can you believe this? I can still remember the name of the dog, and I can't even remember some of my friends' names. That dog, someone said, well, that means that God wanted you to love that dog. I said, I don't know about that, but anyway, so my mother calls us one time. There were 3 brothers. I was born first. Almost 2 years later, my brother Fred, and then another 2 years later, my brother George, and 4 years later, my sister. There are 4 of us. My brother Fred died in California a number of years ago with the Nile fever, some disease that they had over there. And then my brother George is in Texas, and then he's the father of Steve, who's a missionary out there. And my brother Fred, who died as a son, as a missionary under Wycliffe, Bible translator, is also in Tanzania. And so this man gave us this dog, and I don't know how long we had it there. And out there, the dogs can run everywhere. I mean, no one's going to do anything to them, and so it's not as though we really kept it and played with it in the house and so forth. But anyway, my mother called us one evening and said to us, your dad has a hospital there. He has these wards where people who are sick, that's where they live. They stay there during the time they're there. In most of Africa, you go to a hospital, you are not fed. You have to either have your relatives bring you food, or buy food, or in Africa, cook it, which they did. They would have little fires there, and some relative would cook the food, rice and whatever. And so my mother said, your dad has those people, and they're people who are not from here, so they have no relatives. And so I've gotten together with the women from our church, and there's a group of us. Every Tuesday and every Thursday, we go and collect rice and greens and firewood and oil, whatever they need, and we go out there and find those people, and we give them the food that they don't get from anybody else. And he said, this dog of yours eats the food of 3 people. And so I'd like to suggest to you guys that you give that dog away. For some reason, it didn't seem to bother us. It made sense. And I used to see those women come to my mother with all the stuff, and they went out into the hospital. And so we said, okay. And so I just said to myself, that reminded me my mother's importance of people and the necessity that people had priority over anything else as far as animals and so on. But anyway, I grew up there during that Second World War. We had a radio. My dad had to use a car battery. That's back in those days. The radios were run through a big car battery to listen to the news. and find out. And the Belgians, of course, were all concerned because all their relatives. One of the men who was a Belgian administrator was a Jewish man. And of course, if he hadn't been in Congo, he probably would have been killed there. And this man was a good friend of my dad. He finally, after the war, got back to Belgium. Eventually, landed up at the UN in the United Nations here in New York. He had a son. The son became a doctor. And he said to his son, before you do any practice, I want you to go back and visit my friend in Africa, see what he does out there in the villages. And so that man came out there. He was an atheist because I took him back to the airport, and we saw animals alongside the road, and he said, well, that's the way all of us are. We just die, and it's the end of us. And but he came there. He had seen what my dad did, and then went back, and eventually I'm not sure where he ended up, but he was in New York during those years. But the thing that I think that sticks with me regarding my parents, and I don't want to really belabor the point about my parents, but I say to myself, without my parents, I would not only physically, but I learned from my dad things that are just came sort of naturally by seeing it. It reminded me of Philippians chapter 4, where Paul says that those things you've heard from me, seen in me, so forth, do, practice them. And that's what it was there. And I said to myself, my dad did not feel that the focusing on preaching the gospel meant that you don't care about people in other ways. Even if they're pagans, they don't know the Lord. And so because of that, he provided the first medical center in that country, the first maternity, the first schools for the children to get an education. He had a care for leprosy. People who have leprosy were in the villages. He went to the Belgian government and said, those people are not treated well. They're there. They have no way. And the government gave my dad hundreds of thousands of acres. He said, there's no one out there. You go and build a place up there and bring those lepers there and set up a dispensary for them. My dad did that about 4 miles from where I grew up and it's still there today. I don't know how much is it left of leprosy anymore. You know, we had it here in America, and it's completely extinct. But anyway, so I saw that. And, of course, I've gone and preached there after I got back to those people. And he said, did you touch him? I said, I shook hands with him. What do? You get up there, you preach the love of God, and then go and say, I can't touch you? I did. And nothing happened to me. But still, I'm just simply saying I saw my dad doing that. He introduced all the first palm trees, oranges, all the fruit. He ordered it from South Africa, got the people to have those to improve their health. And I say to myself, my dad started helping people make better homes. When he got there, they had very small houses, and the windows were very small. And my dad was one of them to have bigger windows for the air to go through the house. And they said, we can't do that. If we have something bigger, at night the witches come, and they'll come down here and pick us up out of bed and take us out. So we have to make it small enough to where witch can't get in. My dad did not say, well, it's stupid. That's not true. He just went and built his own house, and he had big windows this big. And when his friends came to him and said, you know what's going to happen to you? My goodness, this is big enough, even a big mama could be carried out of there. He said, how no? My dad said, no one can carry me up because the Holy Spirit is here inside. And if those people come, those witches come, he'll take care of me. I can sleep and not have to worry about it. And that's how he began developing with people. He saw that they needed help in planting better crops. He just planted his own garden, and people came and saw what he had and what they had, and he got them, influenced them to change. He had many things that I saw there, and the way he worked was amazing as far as I'm concerned for a man who back in those days never taught anything about culture, anthropology, and all that kind of stuff that we are presently being teaching missionary people. So you ask me why I'm saying this is because I really say to myself, what I saw in my parents affected me so strongly, influenced me so strongly, that even when I went out there, I benefited from the influence of my parents. It flowed into me to where I was respected. When we arrived there, something happened that has never happened to another foreigner. They inducted us into their tribe. They had a big ceremony, and as a young guy, I didn't realize how important that was or what was the deal. But there they were, put it up in at a big stand they put up there, and all the people who were in charge came and inducted us. Said, you are now one of us, because they knew I was born there, and so they considered me one of them. And that was it. We were honored. People came to us when we first arrived, gave us goats and sheep and buckets full of eggs. I think a year later, Becky said, whatever happened to those goats? I said, I think I've given most of them away, because my Bible school students, if your mother-in-law comes to your house, you cannot let her leave without, she can take anything you have there in the house, or if you don't have anything to give to her, you're in trouble, she'll take your wife away. So I had to save a number of my pastors from losing wives by giving a goat, giving them that goat so they could give that to their mother-in-law. So, and just don't have your mother-in-law show up, you'll be in trouble here. and so, let me just close with this regarding my parents. If you ask me today, what is really the basic, what you consider controlling, foundational thing that guides your life? Thankfulness. I cannot think who would I be, where would I have done, what would I have done without my parents? I'm not saying God can't do anything, and God did. In fact, God gave that to them so they could pass it on to me, even though they did it mostly just the way they treated people and worked. My father was a very ingenious man. I mean, he's an entrepreneur. You cannot believe the things that he did there, and I don't have time to go into all that. I think if he was in America, he would have been a millionaire. He said that's the kind of person he was. He changed all kinds of lifestyles out there and showed people how to have a better life and what they could eat and so forth. And so for me, I look at that area of my life so that when I returned as a missionary, the blessings that flowed from my dad to me and the way I was accepted. And then the second generation, my son Bill, when he got there, then he had a double barrel from my dad and me on him, and it was amazing to us how the Africans are very family-oriented, and that's important to them to do that. And so I cannot spend a day, certainly go to bed, the first thing is the idea of Thanksgiving. I try and memorize a few little courses in English so I can sing them to God, but I can't sing them too loud because Imagine can wake her up. So I just sing them to myself in my heart. But I just am thankful to God, just as I'm thankful even for you here. To be frank with you, for 40-some years, I was a member of Rush Creek Bible Church. I started out as Berean, some of you may know, near the school, and moved over to Rush Creek. And moving here and coming here and being with you, and of course, Pastor Gary is a good friend of mine. He was my student, and then he and I team taught for five years before he came to your church here and to our church here. And I thank God. These are thanks. I could have gone some place else, but I came to a place where I felt right at home because this church and Rush Creek, we all are committed to the same programs, same purpose of getting people saved and training our children, very strong youth programs and all that. And so I say that's who I am as far as my lifestyle. One thing about my mother, let me say this. Her dad came from Czechoslovakia. I don't know how old he was, but he came to the Pittsburgh area, grew up there, he got married. My mother was born, when she was 10 years old, her mother died. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, started reading the Bible. He was a Catholic, a very strong Catholic, reading the Bible, and he went to the priest to ask him questions, and the priest said, quit reading that book. So he still kept reading and found something else, and he trusted Christ as Savior. The church excommunicated him, and his family completely rejected him. My mother says she does not know one relative of her family because they completely wouldn't even have anything to do with her and her dad. And my mother was saved And from there, she went to Bible school where, of course, she met my dad. And so that idea of trusting Jesus, you read the Bible, everyone does not have the blessing that you and I have without either, like Muslims and other people today. It's the same thing. You read the Bible, you accept Christ, you're out. If they don't kill you, whatever they're doing in other countries out there, you and I are blessed to be able to be here where we are. When I grew up there in Congo, of course, I learned Swahili outside with my African friends. When we got to the house, my mother said, that's the end. In here, it's English. And so that learned both languages, and over here, Swahili, English. Out here also, another tribal dialect, I could pick it up. It's a tonal language. And then at home, my parents had the Belgians and friends there speaking French all the time, so that became, I didn't know all the grammar and everything. I went to Europe to learn that. But when I go to France, for example, a number of years ago, we were there, and I was speaking, and the guy said, you're not American, are you? I said, what are you talking about? He said, Americans don't speak French that way. But you see, it's because of the tone that I learned of listening to all these people. Here it is inside of me. And so I was blessed in that way. And so when I was eventually, I decided it's time for me to go, to come to school. I came to, what we have as Grace Christian University was Milwaukee Bible College when I came to Milwaukee. And so my parents just put me, before that, let me just say one more. When I was 13, my parents said, it's good you go see your grandparents. My parents were out there for 31 years without coming to America. My dad was very, very concerned, and sometimes he told me when he did come, while I was gone, I heard a lot of children died because I wasn't there to treat them. And so that kept my dad and mom. They had no one to replace them. They stayed, and they sent the three brothers to. Can you imagine getting on the plane, first time on the plane? And there you go. And we went up and spent a night in the city, on the way to the capital city where we got a plane to America. And we were sitting, the three boys, outside there. They had a big veranda. And an American came to us and started speaking to us. And he was an important man from, I think it's from Rhode Island, New England anyway, who had connection with the mining companies, and he was involved in that way. And he said, well, how are you going to get to America? I said, well, tomorrow we'll go to the capital city, and there they're going to find a place for us. And at that time, the Pan Am American Airlines were going to Congo. And that was one flight a week. And he said, you're not going to be able to get a seat there just going there because there's so many people at the end of the war here are trying to get back to America. So he called up and told his office, get me 3 seats. And when we got there, we were able to just get our paperwork and so forth, and we were able to leave for the United States. To see again a person like that who's businessman, just see these 3 kids there, came out and helped us and that. And I still remember his name. His name and the dog, those 2. Go back. But, and so those kind of things during my life of people just showing up in one way or another. And so we flew to New York, through Europe, and eventually New York. And I had an uncle there. He took us to Pennsylvania, where we stayed for our grandparents for 1 year. And then the second year, my grandfather sold his house and bought a farm outside the city. My 2 brothers went with him, and I stayed in town with an uncle and aunt. And of course, we had never seen a baseball game. We'd never seen football. All that kind of stuff was just the first thing for us to get back there and find out. Though I do remember one thing. One day we decided that we need to go and see, get hitchhiking. We had never hitchhiked before. We were going to try and hitchhike to Pittsburgh to go see a baseball game at Forbes Field. And so we did. And then we took a bus back because it was getting late in the evening. And so those are the type of things that we sort of got involved in with playing football, playing softball. But we really just, all that was zero to us, though my mother had tried to put that into us in our studies of what America is like. And so it's not as though we were shocked to death to see something that we never thought. But it really was a time of 2 years that we were able to get acclimated to a certain extent to America. At the end of that, my father sent word back to his dad and said, I want you to send my kids back. 2 years is enough. And so, again here, we get on a bus or train, I can't remember now, from Pennsylvania all the way down to New Orleans. My dad had contacted the Salvation Army, and they had one of the leaders. They picked us up, kept us at the place for a day or two, and put us on a freighter in New Orleans, 51 days to Africa. A freighter, of course, is not a passenger ship. They have room for about 10 or 12 people, and there are Assemblies of God missionaries there. There's one Afro-American journalist, and the three of us. And down to Brazil, we went to 3, 4, 5 ports, then across the Atlantic, all the way to Dakar in North Africa, and then down the coast, and then one full day up the Congo River. And because of the falls, that was the end that the ship could go. And my parents had taken, by truck, came to meet us, though they were still in the capital city, and the Swedish missionaries picked us up and then put us on the train and went and met my parents. And then we drove for 10 days to get back to where we came from in Congo. And so the experiences, I can still, one thing I tell you about my mother, she was a woman of prayer. When we were driving back, they had ferries that you'd put your truck up on the ferry to go across the rivers. And the truck, sometime when my father went up on there, it almost dipped to where water went into the canoes because these were small ferries. My mother, as soon as we was waiting to go on, she'd walk up behind where she couldn't see and prayed. And then when, I can still remember as a missionary, and we were planning what to do, something is going on, she would come to us and say, did you guys ever pray? She always reminded us that. As a kid running around into the house and back, my mother was always in a corner with some African women, teaching them and praying with them. And that still remained with me as a very strong part of my life, to see that experience of my mother always praying with people. And so, anyway, we came back, and I was fortunate when we came back. Chris Egemeyer, Mr. Pickett, you know Mr. Pickett. Pearl Pickett and Martha Pickett moved to Kama, where my dad was, to start the first Bible school. He started Kama Bible Institute, and it trained pastors. The only people who went to the school were pastors, people. And, of course, we had pastors who had never had any training, so they came in to be in part of the students there. They might have had 1 or 2 or 3 people who had not been a pastor yet, but he did that for 2 years. He taught that. Abby and Judy, the 2 girls, and the 3 of us and my sister were the MKs running around the place there. And that was a difference to us to have her there. We had a great time with the missionary parties and so forth together. But Chris Egemeyer is the one. Pearl Pickett answered some of my biblical questions when I talked to him. But Chris Egemeyer, I don't know if anybody remembers Chris Egemeyer anymore. He lived to be 105. He died just about the year that I left the mission board. I'd gone to see him, and down in North Carolina, and he passed away. But anyway, he took me under the wings, and he said, I'm going to start. Remember back, if any of you go back there, you remember the Youth for Christ crusades and meetings that we used to have that they had in different places. I remember as a choir, we came over here to sing for at one of the Saturday night Youth for Christ meetings. Chris was on the board that started that in Chicago before he became a missionary. And so he started that there at Kama, and he had me. I learned how to lead singing. 16, 17 years old. I had a harmonica that I could play, so I trained 4 other guys and African friends of mine, and we would do the special music for harmonicas. It wouldn't get very far here in America, but there, to them, that's the only instrument that they knew about. And so he started teaching me. He's the one who taught me to preach. First sermon I did was because of Chris Egemeyer. And then when he'd go out on the weekends to the villages to do evangelism and teaching scriptures, he took me with him. And so I was blessed to have him. was a very good friend of my dad and mom, and so we called him Uncle Chris. Back in those days, missionary kids called the missionaries Uncle Chris and Auntie Edna. And they had fun. Chris was a man who had all kinds of jokes and stuff that he was always saying something that get you to laugh, and so they would have us kids there at his house. The difference with Mr. Pickett, he has his time because he taught the next morning. He has his time to go to bed. I don't care if we were there playing. He said, "Okay, you guys, good night," and he went to bed and left us there. But Chris Eggemeyer was there with us at the time. So I was blessed even in my teenage years, studying, but still having those kind of influences in my life. And that's when I came into contact, and someone gave me Mr. Baker's God's Clock of the Ages, and O'Hare's On Search for Riches, and that really got me going. I forgot, I'm going to back up something here. When I came to the States, I was 13, 14, my grandfather took me to some big, I don't want to call it a revival meeting, but something. Back in those days, they had camp meetings in the summer and so forth. And I grew up knowing the scriptures. I can memorize any of from John 3:16 on, and even taught kids. But I still have never figured out in my mind to where the thought that came to me. My dad and mom are missionaries. They're serving God. You're in their family, and therefore you're in the family of God. And that was just, it was one of those things that I might have even made some kind of confession. I can't remember that, but at this time, a man gave an invitation at this meeting. And I said to myself, I have to say to you now, as I think of it, the preaching was horrible. I mean, it's just, I felt the invitation and explaining the gospel, it's what's the reason it makes me, I want to hear the gospel spoken very clearly, because if I hadn't had that background of the Bible, it would have been different for me to understand what he was talking about. But he asked us to come forward, and I figured I want to make a confession of faith. I'll go up there, which I did. But with them, there was no assurance. You hang in there until you make it to the end. And as soon as I got back to Africa at age 16 there, Chris Eggemeyer and those people, we began talking together and teaching. And that's when I really came to understand that my salvation was eternal. And it didn't depend on my works to where I'm going to make it to the end, which unfortunately I would say the majority of Christians in the world, if you count the Catholics and everybody else, that's where they are, hoping that they'll get to the end being good. And in some way, then if you're a good Catholic, you may go to purgatory for a few years, then you'll still get to heaven. But the idea that John says, I'm writing to you that you may know that you have eternal life. You who have believed on Jesus. Those expressions are very difficult for some people to accept. And I've had them tell me, well, as where I'm standing now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to tell you that I know for sure, because I'm not dead yet. So actually, you're better off to just die quickly and make it to heaven. Another thing that when I was in Milwaukee, then I came to Milwaukee, and Dwight Reed, different ones at Harold Peterson, we were all there together at that time, Jack Dean and others. And when I first got there, and of course I had no place to go during the summer. Back in those days, missionary kids didn't just get on a plane and fly back to Africa or wherever you went. So I stayed in the dorm. Can you imagine? I stayed there for 9 months and another 3 months in my room that I had there. And so I got a third shift job with American Can Company in Milwaukee. And I worked there, and then eventually I went to camp for a week, and Al Riemersma was in my cabin. He was a good baseball player, so we had a good time there. We beat everybody else. He and two friends of his. And so I would do that every summer, go to Grace and be a counselor there. Back in those days, they only had 2 weeks of counseling of students, of people there, campers. And that was my life. But then, I can't remember, it's probably my third year, I have been invited to speak at North Shore Church. That's where Pastor O'Hare was. And at that time, I met a number of people. I went to camp. I met a lot of kids from Chicago. But eventually, Becky Stringfellow was her name. And I would have been either finishing a second, going into a third year. She came a year after me. But anyway, and everybody knew it was sort of a rumor going around. Don't you, if you're afraid to go to Africa, don't you go get close to Sam Vinton. I mean, he has said he's leaving for Africa. And that wasn't my purpose. I'm going to study so I can go out there and teach. And then as we got to know each other, she told me about how at high school, at one of those Christian meetings that they had, one of the guys from Moody Bible Institute challenged them to think about becoming missionaries. And she said, that's the last thing I wanted to do, but he was so strongly in his conviction to us to trust God. Don't worry about what's going to happen to you and so forth. Just believe if God wants you to go, he'll take care of you. And so, therefore, I didn't have to convert her to become a missionary. And then we got engaged and they went to the mission board and we applied to be missionaries. And they accepted us. We graduated. I was ordained. And we got married 2 weeks later. And then we started deputation, visiting churches. And by November, we were in Europe for language study. And then from there, while we were there, we find out that we're expecting. Becky's is pregnant. And so we had to figure out how we're going to get there, because after 7th month, you could not fly. So we left just at the beginning of the 7th month and went to Congo. And a month later, in a sort of premature way, I'm not going into the story, but Bill was born. And he was born with all our missionaries were gone on some trip, my dad, the nurse, and everybody. So an African friend of mine had a car there, so I took a car, went about 40 miles to a mining company where they had a hospital. Unfortunately, the hospital, the doctor was an Italian doctor who had done his internship in the army, so he knew nothing about delivering babies. And but anyway, closer to midnight, we felt that I took her back. And of course, back in those days, once you put her back as a man, you had to get out of there. You never would be there to the birth of the child. And Bill was born, and right there, they just put him and wrapped him up and, okay, put him in the car and take him over to your house where you are. And fortunately, we had a nurse, Eldora Kincaid from Phoenix area. She still has relatives there. She was a nurse. I went and got her, and she came and then took care of Bill at that time through that. Here's an interesting story. When I came back to teach at Grace Bible College, and Bill had just graduated from the 5-year program that I had there, he and about 10 students, we went together to Africa. Becky took 160 puppets. I would say most of them were made by Mrs. Brookhouse. There were 2 women, and I think some other woman from another church. And so Becky she trained 5 people how to do puppets. And we translated a lot of those things into Swahili and put them on tape and so forth so that they could do them there. And then I took several men to go and help me go out and speak, Bill amongst them. And we were out in that area where he was born, and an old woman came to him and said, "I'm your mother." I said, "Yeah, my mother's over there at Kama." She said, "I'm the one who delivered you. That doctor knew nothing. I'm the one who delivered you." And so she's a Christian in our churches there. So those are the things that you get blessed by, to see how God works in a variety of ways. When we got to Congo, automatically they said, "You're in charge of the Bible school. You're the director, and you're going to teach." And I had the school year was almost over. I had 2 months to teach, and then from then on, I ran this teaching program. After 1 year, I felt that the 2-year program we had was not strong enough, and so I started a program of 3 years of pastor school, and those who had finished 2 years and proved themselves for at least 5 years of ministry could come to that school. And, again, here's God working. The first graduation took place just about 2-3 weeks before independence came. And those key men that when the missionaries left, who took over and began forming the grace churches out there, were those who had been in that class, in that first class. And so missionaries had to leave with troubles that came there, and those men together worked, 3 of them especially, and took us all the way to the place where we were accredited by the government and the schools and everything because of those 3 men who had been trained there before independence came. And so I think that the last ministry I had in Congo before I came to the States was translating the Bible. And it wasn't a fact that there was never any Bible in Swahili, but the Swahili Bibles were King James type Bibles. And so they wanted me to translate something into the normal language of people and the way people speak. And so I went for a month of training of key men, Dr. Naida, top linguist in the world, and others who, therefore, 1 month training. And then I headed up a committee of 4 of us under the Universal Bible Society from England. And that is the ministry. At that time, I was asked to come and teach at Grace Bible College. And I said, well, I'm not going to come until I finish this job, but until my daughter graduates from high school. I'm not going to take her from a good Christian high school here and take her into America, where we were hearing about students rioting in churches and in schools and burning down places and so forth. And so in 1976 is when I came back, and that's where, from teaching there, going back to school, because I only had a bachelor's degree, so I worked for about 8 years to finally get a doctorate to complete my study. Then I became the president, and then after 5 years, the mission wanted me to leave the school and become a director, and that's where I ended up retiring from 12 years ago. But actually, I retired only last year. I finally said, at being 90 years old, I'm not going to teach these kids anymore. Let the young guys do it. And so, anyway, that's where my story is. A lot more. This is only the top-notch types of things, but great experiences. One experience that really stands out to me of a funny kind is that Bill and Debbie, my kids, were going to a school about 800 miles away. Big American school, fabulous. It's considered to be the second best school in all of Africa. So the kids from there get a great education. They were home, and I was up in his room, which is a second story, and down there you could look up in the backyard room. These people would bring vegetables, and they carried them on their heads on big flat things, all kinds of vegetables. The Belgians had really planted a lot of good vegetables, and it's a nice climate for that. So we had all kinds of vegetables, anything you want to. And so they come there, try and sell them to you. And so they're out there standing there with Becky, and Bill and I are in his room overlooking, and he had a firecracker. So he tosses that firecracker out there. And the guy, of course, we've been having wars and fighting and guns out. And that guy got so scared and took off, and all these vegetables went flying all over into the air. And he took off and charged down. And Becky was so upset. She came up thinking it was just Bill was there. And finding Bill and myself on the floor just laughing like crazy. That was the end for the two of us for a while. We had some of those experiences, good experiences you think about. Anyway, I consider myself blessed by God, and that's my thankfulness for the fact that God put me through the experience that I did out there, growing up, knowing languages that I was able to go back. Can you realize I got back on the mission field and started teaching the Bible the very next week as I got there because of the language. And then the teaching in French, which is the other language that I studied and so forth. So all those things, again, is thanks to God. And I don't know if any of you remember that song we used to sing back in the old days, "Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul." You know, that it comes to my mind quite often when I'm going to bed. It's just that. And then thank you, Jesus, for all you've done. Thank you, Lord. There's those little courses that cause you to think of what God has done. And I think I told my students, every year when I started, I wrote Thanksgiving on the bottom of the blackboard. I said, if you don't have a thankful heart, you'll never have compassion because you're still looking for yourself. Thankfulness shows that you have gotten something from God and you want, in some way, you want to feel for people. And that's the next, on the second level, you put down the whole idea of the fact of compassion. But like my dad said, compassion is not enough until you do something about it. And that's where action comes in. And that is my motto and what I've adapted for my life, looking at my parents, for which I'm thankful. So I think I'll stop there. And any questions that you might have? Yes, I see two hands here.
Dr. Sam, did you? It's on. Do you remember your father leading people to Christ? Does any of those stick out in your mind?
Not individually. Preaching, yes. Evangelistic sermons.
Okay.
Preaching. But as I mentioned, I think to my class there the other day, my dad, back in those days, I sometimes really wonder what mission organizations were thinking about. But the big thing was for you to be baptized, and they would put up a thing on your neck, the name of the society, and that was sort of the sign of being saved. But you had to be baptized. And when I was back in the States as a young person, this is behind me, my dad heard people being asked, "Are you a Christian?" He said, "I'll be one when Mr. Vinton baptizes me." My father got so upset at that to say, I'm going to be blamed to saying that the way to get to heaven is through baptism. He quit baptizing. He said, forget it. I'm not going to be responsible for you people. And people like to have things, something they can grab on to. And so I never saw him one-on-one. I saw him talking to people. Most of the people who came to him were people coming for advice and all kinds of other things I heard him do. But as far as his preaching, and of course, when he started preaching in the villages and starting churches, I wasn't even born then. But in his preaching, my first sermons that I ever heard were by my dad in Swahili. I can still remember him teaching us about Joseph, the story of Joseph. My dad was really great in taking Bible stories and telling them, because that's the way the Africans connect with people, is stories and then applying it. And so I can still remember him teaching, going through Joseph and Joseph's story in the Old Testament. But I never had an incident where he sat there and I could see it, because most of the time I wasn't with him like that anyway.
How old were your parents when they left Africa, the Congo?
Okay, I think my dad, as far as any records I've read, my dad is the longest serving Protestant missionary. I say Protestant because there could be a Catholic priest in some of these places where they stay forever till they die. But my dad was 76 years in Congo. My mother died 20 years before that. She had a heart attack, and just in 1 minute she was gone. And my dad continued for another 20 years, but from the time he left here and the time he came back and he died about 10 months later is 76 years. And like I said, 30 years without ever coming back to America after they got married. And then they would come back for 3 months, 6 months at the most, until his life. And when my dad came back, he had actually, after his in year 76 years, he had a stroke that touched only his voice to putting words together. And he was by himself down in the jungle, still out there working with people in the medical center and preaching over there. He came back to where my son was, and we tried to convince him that at your age, at that time, he would have been 96 and a half. Convinced that he could come back. But he knew they could take care of him there. But we knew that with the African culture, someone dies, they don't die just because they're old. there's some witchcraft or something has happened to you. And so even though you could be taken care of by these women there, take care of him and feed him and so forth, when he died, those people would go after those women. Well, why did you let him die? My goodness, he's 97. That doesn't make any difference. They have to figure out some way why you die. I can remember, for example, people, they cut trees down to plant their gardens out there. And if a tree fell and killed someone or hurt someone, the witch doctor would have to come and figure out who caused that. Not the stupidity of the guy cutting a tree, but it couldn't happen naturally. So we brothers, the three of us, we said, he's going to pay attention to us. We'll send our sister out there. Because she was the last one, and she was, we call her, that was his prize, and Joy was my daughter, our sister, his daughter. And so we sent her back there, and she brought him back. And she lived with him for about 7 months, and then he got a fever, and went to a hospital. In 3 days, he went into a coma. The doctor said he only lived for another 4 days because he had a strong heart. And then he passed away, and he's buried next to his father in Indiana, Pennsylvania. We were able to. There was still one lot left where my grandparents are buried and my couple aunts. So anyway, that's, yes.
I'm just wondering, what is the status of all the work that your dad and that you and others did in Congo? I know that we don't have any missionaries there now, and I know with all of the ongoing turmoil and everything, just wondering, what is the status of the ministries, the schools, everything there now?
Okay, 2 years ago, it'll be 3 years this summer, I went there. I just took off to go, and there's no missionaries, like I said, but fine. I went there. People came, and I stayed at the house that I had lived in with the kids when I was there, and talked to the people. We still have 300-400 churches. We have over 30,000 students in our schools. Now, the thing is this, because of all the situations, getting books, getting materials, I'm sure we could have $10 million given to us. We could use all of it just to roofing the buildings and doing all what we have over there. We have high schools, grade schools with 30 to 40,000 students. The problem that's been over there is tribalism. And the pastor who was president of our grace churches in the Congo, he died. And the mentality of when you're in charge like a chief, and when the chief dies, who takes his place? The son, a relative anyway, right? And so that caused trouble because his relatives start causing trouble that we have to find someone to replace him as though he's a king and now he's dead and the prince takes over. And that caused a lot of turmoil that is still going on right now because they've chosen a new person. And they try to cause trouble and go to the government and accuse of many things. I talked to them. The connections have been bad lately. I have not talked to them in the last week or so, but pretty much I would talk to them at least 3-4 times a week. I still work with them. And they do need a lot of encouragement and work. The situation where I grew up, there are no roads for cars anymore. We have the airstrip that my father built there with Wayne Schoonover. Planes come in. If I had some pictures to show you, they didn't take all the material, what they brought back. They would put it on the back of a bicycle and take it to a certain store over here, people, the commercial people who bought that. In one of those pictures I have, they even tied a pig on the back of the bicycle to take it to where they were going. But as far as cars, no vehicles can drive. The roads are all gone to pot. The government is not doing anything. And you know, the government is like our Washington. They are way across on the other side we're on the east side and they're on the west side. No way you could drive or get there any other way except by an airplane. And so they've just forsaken this area of the country over here. And so, but the church is still going. The Bible schools are still going. But again, the lack of books, materials that we would provide for them and are lacking. But this church is still there, and in fact, you might have seen some pictures here of big buildings, churches. My dad built 3 churches. One when I was small, this very small area, maybe as big as this area right here. And then he built the second one, which is had a tower on it. And then the biggest one that he built in the 70s is the one that last 2 years ago, they found out that all the metal roofing had rusted. Okay, there's a building right there. They're still working on it when I was there. You see the metal roofing on there had rusted, which meant that when they took that off with the rains, that whole thing would collapse. My daughter, Debbie, came to me and said, Dad, I'd like to do something for my mother. I said, well, your mother, where she used to teach and where you went to church first, has no metal roofing. It's all back. So she paid for them to have all that metal roofing you have there as a gift that she gave to them. And they fixed up the inside. They even have a ceiling where most buildings in Africa, churches are. You just see the roof, and that's it on top there. They've done a fantastic job. They hired an engineer who came and helped them. And I was completely amazed at how well they've done. What they're working on now is getting benches made. But as far as the building is concerned, it's in very good shape. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your legacy, Dr. Sam. This has just been amazing to me. This is just an interesting tidbit that I'd like to share. Back in June 29, 1963, I know where your parents were. Do you?
No. And that's it. That was the first, after 30 years, in 63 is when they came here. And I'm sure Evansville was one of the towns.
Yes, yes.
We had a church out there where he would have gone.
They happened to be in town candidating, or whatever you call it, anyway, talking about their mission trip, and they attended our wedding. We were thrilled because we could tell everybody in the world that we had people at our wedding from the Congo.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Yes.
The Congo's been really politically charged often, off and on. Did you guys ever feel threatened?
Well, they got independence in 1960. And that's our graduation I talked about when we had our top leaders who graduated from pastor school that I started. We had the graduation. That was the end of our 5-year term. We left around the 15th of June. On the 30th, they got independence. And from that time, from the Belgians. And so from that time on, you're right. Our people, especially a lot of Catholics, were killed because they were angry at the Catholics because they were Belgians. Because Belgium was the one who was ruling the country, yes. And so there was time we had to evacuate. We had twice that I can remember that we had to leave. And when we left, later on, those people came and they didn't destroy the buildings, but they took all the stuff, paper, my first ordination paper, all those kind of things that I had there, completely taken away. Another time we had to flee from the city when the government had hired mercenaries. You know what mercenaries are? The people who fight because they couldn't get rid of the rebels, so they got these mercenaries, but then they didn't pay them. So these mercenaries then attacked the city and took over the city. The American government was there, had a man there, so we had to leave. And of course, they got into our houses. All my library was thrown out. The only book, I picked up 2 books. One on eschatology, end of the tribulation period, and then another book called How to Be a Bishop Without Being Religious. Those are the 2 books I found. Bill Rigg and others gave me a lot of books when I went back to replenish my libraries there. And so those troubles have really continued. And then the last one was when we had Mobutu, who was a man who ruled the country as though he owned it. And so that caused a lot of trouble. So one of his enemies finally came in, got power, and then march all the way across there and deposed him. When he was marching through there, the soldiers were running away from this guy coming with his troops, and they went through my son Bill and his wife. They were in a place where those guys came there, and Bill could have been killed very easily. The Lord just protected him, but because he stood up for the rights of a couple of pastors that they wanted to lock up and said, no, these are pastors and so forth. So anyway, and then they would just steal vehicles and then take off and go. And so since that would have been a year around 2000. Since that time, we really have not had any of that kind of rebellion. But the uncertainty, because tribes are different areas of the country, so whoever gets into power runs the country. And I used to tell these people, we in America don't have this kind of stuff. Now I couldn't say it anymore. I appreciate the fact that you've come out this evening, again, in my mind, to recollect and to think a little bit about my parents and what they have done. And that hospital my father built is still there. In 2028, the church out there will be celebrating my father's 100th anniversary. And one of the projects that I will be talking to our churches and all my relatives is I want to make sure that we do something to beef up that hospital. The x-ray machines are broken. There are different things that are needed for us to be able to do that. And because one is called Baba V Hospital, my father and my mother's name, maternity, to get all that thing taken care of, and everybody will be trying to do different things to make that place come alive again. And so that's what I'm saying. I doubt if in 3 years from now I'll go, but if someone said I'm going to live to be 105, then maybe I'll go. But maybe for sure, I'm sure the Lord willing, Bill would go and represent our family there. But they're in the process of thinking now, what do we need to do to restore some of these things? And the hospital for me was the first thing my dad did that to help people besides preaching. And it's there. And we have 2 African Congolese doctors who are working there now. And I just got a word from a man who he's a doctor, but he found out he made more money being a senator. So he quit doing his medical doctor work, but he talks to me, he calls me. In fact, he called me to congratulate me when Trump won. They do that kind of stuff to congratulate me. Anyway, he told me, he said, we're working with the government to make Kama Hospital to be the biggest hospital in that whole area. Government is going to come and try and do something to really give all the authority and so forth, and possibly provide medicines more than they do now. And so the Lord can do a lot of things there, but, and let's put it this way, the people that I met, maybe you saw a picture of some old guy standing next to me. He and I are the same age. Because he was one of my first students when I went back to start teaching in the Bible school there. He is now a chief of a village. And he and I are the same age. He could be 1 year older or 1 year less than that. Because to ask him that, at that time, they didn't know for sure when they were born. And in any case, to see people coming, he lives about 60 miles away. And he's old. He has to get someone on a motorcycle to either carrying him there, or he just walked for 3-4 days slowly to get there. And so it was wonderful for me to go back and to see a few former students. Most of them are dead. Most of the pastors, the ordained pastors and so forth who are there now are Bill students. And but we have several hundred pastors. And so we thank the Lord for what he's doing there. Again, I appreciate you coming. It'll give me a chance now to go and rethink and try and put this stuff together so I can at least have something for my kids to see and to go over as far as my history. People have told my dad to write a book. My dad said, why would I waste my time writing a book when I've got job to do here? So, but it's too bad he didn't, because his history would have been something important. Though Dale DeWitt did interview my dad, and I was trying to get that stuff copied, made copies. Anybody here who's a great transcriber, come and see me. We got some, I think I got something else that we can have done, which would help. Okay, Pastor.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, for sharing and for your legacy and faithfulness all these years. It's been a blessing to us. If you have more questions for Dr. Sam, he's here. You can talk to him afterwards. But he's always open to talk as well and share many more stories than he could have time to share here. There's so much more going on and that he's been through. So we're grateful for him. One more time, let's give him another round of applause. And for our tech team in the back, Pastor Jerry lovingly putting together the PowerPoint for us. Great job, Pastor Jerry. And Chris running the sound wonderfully. Yeah. Any applause for me? I'm just kidding. Let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, you are so good to us. And as we hear stories from people that have lived much different lives than us, we recognize how deep the gospel is and how profound it is. We're grateful for our own lives that have been transformed and changed by your Son. And as we hear about things that are going on in Congo and in Europe and so many different places where your word has gone out, we're just so overwhelmed by that, Father. The gospel is so much bigger than each one of us, and yet we get to participate with what you're doing, and that's such a blessing. Thank you for Dr. Sam and his willingness to share. Thank you for his faithfulness all these years and for the legacy that he's gotten from his parents too. And we're so grateful to be able to experience that and carry it on into the future too. You are good to us, and Dr. Sam's life is a life well lived, and we're grateful for him too. We pray all these things in your Son. Amen. You're dismissed.